pawn d6, pawn c3, bishop e7, knight b1, d2, castles kingside, knight f1, pawn b5, bishop b3, pawn d5, queen e2, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, bishop e6, bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6, knight g3, queen d7, castles kingside, rook a8, d8, pawn a4, queen d3, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, rook a6, rook d6, king h1, knight d7, bishop e3, rook d8, pawn h3, pawn h6, rook f1, a1, knight d7, b8, rook a8, rook d1, king h2, rook takes a1, rook takes a1, knight d7, pawn b4, king f7, knight f1, bishop d6, pawn g3, knight f6, knight f1, d2, king e7, rook a6, knight b8, rook a5, pawn c6, king g2, knight b8, d7, king f1, rook c8, knight e1, knight e8, knight d3, knight c7, pawn c4, pawn takes c4, knight takes c4, knight b5, rook a6, king f6, bishop c1, bishop b8, bishop b2, pawn c5, knight b6, knight takes b6, rook takes b6, pawn c4, knight c5, pawn c3, bishop c1, knight d4, knight d7, king e7, Knight takes b8. Knight b3. Rook b7. King d8. Rook d7. King e8. Rook takes g7. Rook takes b8. Rook takes b8. Knight takes b8. Knight b3. Bishop a3. Pawn c2. Knight c6. Pawn e4. Pawn e6. Pawn d4. Pawn d5. Knight c3. Knight f6. Bishop g5. Bishop b4. Pawn e5. Pawn h6. Bishop d2. Bishop takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Knight e4. Queen g4. Pawn g6. Bishop d3. Knight takes d2. King takes d2. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Queen f4. Queen c7. Pawn h4. Pawn f5. Pawn g4. Pawn takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight e7. Pawn takes f5. Pawn e6 takes f5. Bishop b5. King f8. Bishop d3. Bishop e6. Knight g1. King f7. Knight h3. Rook a8, c8. Rook h1, g1. Pawn b6. Pawn h5. Queen c3. King e2. Knight c6. Pawn takes g6. King g7. Rook a1, d1. Knight takes d4. King f1. Rook h8, e8. Rook g3. Knight c6. Queen h4. Knight takes e5. Knight f4. Knight g4. Knight takes e6. Rook takes e6. Bishop takes f5. Queen c4. King g1. Knight takes f2. Queen takes c4. Rook takes c4. King takes f2. Rook f4. Rook f3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn e6. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Pawn e3. Pawn b6. Knight g1, e2. Bishop a6. Knight g3. Bishop takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Pawn d5. Queen f3. Castles kingside. Pawn e4. Pawn takes e4. Knight takes e4. Knight takes e4. Queen takes e4. Queen d7. Bishop a3. Rook e8. Bishop d3. Pawn f5. Queen takes a8. Knight c6. Queen takes e8. Queen takes e8. Castles kingside. Knight a5. Rook a1, e1. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes c4. Knight takes c4. Bishop c1. Pawn c5. Pawn takes c5. Pawn takes c5. Bishop f4. Pawn h6. Rook e2. Pawn g5. Bishop e5. Queen d8. Rook f1, e1. King f7. Pawn h3. Pawn f4. King h2. Pawn a6. Rook e4. Queen d5. Pawn h4. Knight e3. Rook e1 takes e3. Pawn takes e3. Rook takes e3. Queen takes a2. Rook f3. King e8. Bishop g7. Queen c4. Pawn takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Rook f8. King d7. Rook a8. King c6. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Pawn e6. Knight b5. Pawn d6. Bishop f4. Pawn e5. Bishop e3. Knight f6. Bishop g5. Bishop e6. Knight b1 c3. Pawn a6. Bishop takes f6. Pawn takes f6. Knight a3. Knight d4. Bishop c4. Pawn b5. Bishop takes e6. Pawn takes e6. Knight e2. Knight c6. Knight g3. Queen d7. Pawn c4. Knight d4. Castles kingside. Pawn b4. Knight c2. Knight takes c2. Queen takes c2. Pawn h5. Rook f1 d1. Pawn h4. Knight f1. Rook g8. Pawn a3. Pawn h3. Pawn g3. Pawn takes a3. Rook takes a3. Queen c6. Queen e2. Pawn f5. Pawn c5. Queen takes e4. Queen takes e4. Pawn takes e4. Pawn takes d6. Bishop h6. Rook a5. King d7. Rook takes e5. Bishop g7. Rook takes e4. Bishop takes b2. Knight e3. pawn a5, knight c4, rook g8, b8, rook h4, king c6, rook h7, bishop d4, rook c7, king d5, pawn d7, pawn a4, knight b6, rook takes b6, rook c8, rook d6, rook takes a8, rook takes d7, rook takes a4, pawn e5, king f1, rook b7, pawn f4, king e6, pawn takes e5, rook f7, king e2, rook f2, king d3, bishop takes e5, rook e1, pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, pawn a6, bishop c4, pawn e6, bishop b3, knight b8, d7, pawn f4, knight c5, pawn f5, knight f6 takes e4, pawn takes e6, queen h4, pawn g3, knight takes g3, knight f3, queen h5, pawn takes f7, king d8, rook g1, knight f5, knight d5, queen takes f7, Bishop g5. King e8. Queen e2. Bishop e6. Knight f4. King d7. Castles queenside. Queen e8. Bishop takes e6. Knight takes e6. Queen e4. Pawn g6. Knight takes e6. Pawn e4. Pawn e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Pawn a6. Bishop takes c6. Pawn d7 takes c6. Castles kingside. Pawn f6. Pawn d4. Bishop g4. Pawn c3. Pawn takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Queen d7. Pawn h3. Bishop e6. Knight c3. Castles queenside. Bishop f4. Knight e7. Rook c1. Knight g6. Bishop g3. Bishop d6. Knight a4. Bishop takes g3. Pawn takes g3. King b8. Knight c5. Queen d6. Queen a4. King a7. Knight takes a6. Bishop takes h3. Pawn e5. Knight takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight c5. King b8. Pawn takes h3. Pawn e4. Knight takes e4. Queen e7. Rook c3. Pawn b5. Queen c2. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Bishop e3. Rook e8. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Queen takes d8. Knight takes d8. Knight b5. Knight e6. Knight g5. Rook e7. Rook f1, d1. Pawn b6. Pawn c5. Knight takes c5. Rook d8. Bishop f8. Knight takes a7. Rook takes a7. Rook takes c8. King g7. Pawn f3. Knight e8. Pawn a3. Knight d6. Rook d8. Pawn h6. Knight h3. Knight e6. Rook b8. Rook e8. Rook takes e8. Knight takes e8. Bishop b5. Knight d6. Bishop f1. Knight b7. Knight f2. Bishop c5. Bishop takes c5. Knight b7 takes c5. Rook d1. Pawn h5. Rook d5. King f6. Pawn h4. King e7. Bishop c4. Pawn c6. Rook d2. Knight d4. King f1. Pawn f5. Pawn b4. Pawn b5. Bishop g8. Pawn takes e4. Pawn takes e4. Knight d7. Rook d3. Rook a6. Rook c3. Pawn c5. Pawn g4. Pawn c4. Pawn takes h5. Pawn takes h5. Bishop d5. Knight f6. Rook g3. Knight takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Rook f6. King g2. Knight f5. Rook h3. Rook g6. King f3. Knight d4. King e3. Rook g2. Rook h1. King d6. Knight e4. King takes d5. Knight c3. King e6. Rook c1. Rook h2. Pawn a4. Rook h3. King f2. Knight b3. King g2. Knight takes c1. King takes h3. Pawn takes a4. Knight takes a4. Knight e2. Pawn b5. Pawn c3. Pawn b6. Pawn c2. Knight c5. King d5. Knight b3. King c6. King g2. King takes b6. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight c6. Bishop c4. Pawn e6. Bishop e3. Bishop e7. Bishop b3. Castles kingside. Queen e2. Queen a5. Castles queenside. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Bishop d7. King b1. Bishop c6. Pawn f4. Rook a8, d8. Rook h1, f1. Pawn b5. Pawn f5. pawn b4, pawn takes e6, pawn takes c3, pawn takes f7, king h8, rook f5, queen b4, queen f1, knight takes e4, pawn a3, queen b7, queen f4, bishop a4, queen g4, bishop f6, rook takes f6, bishop takes b3, rook f4, bishop a2, pawn d5, queen e5, knight f6, rook takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, rook takes d2, pawn takes d2, pawn c3, queen takes b3, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen g4, king h8, queen d4, rook h5, knight c3, king takes b2, knight takes d1, king c1, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, bishop d7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen takes b4, queen takes f7, knight takes d1, king b1, queen takes d4, rook takes h7, king takes h7, queen h5, pawn d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn g6, pawn g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles kingside, castles kingside, pawn d6, knight c3, knight b8, d7, pawn b3, pawn e5, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, pawn e4, Rook e8. Bishop a3. Pawn c6. Bishop d6. Queen a5. Queen d3. Rook e6. Pawn b4. Queen a3. Bishop c7. Queen takes b4. Rook a1, b1. Queen e7. Rook f1, d1. Knight e8. Bishop a5. Rook d6. Queen e2. Rook takes d1. Queen takes d1. Bishop f8. Knight d2. Queen a3. Knight c4. Queen c5. Bishop f1. Pawn b5. Knight d2. Queen a3. Knight b3. Knight c5. Bishop takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Knight takes b5. Queen a4. Knight takes c5. Queen takes a5. Queen d5. Rook b8. Pawn a4. Bishop h3. Queen takes e5. Rook c8. Knight d3. Queen takes a4. Knight e1. Pawn a6. Knight d4. Bishop g7. Rook c7. Rook a1. Queen d7. Rook takes a6. Rook takes a7. Rook takes a7. Queen takes a7. Queen takes e8. Queen a1. Pawn e4. Pawn e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Pawn a6. Bishop a4. Knight f6. Castles kingside. Bishop e7. Rook e1. Pawn b5. Bishop b3. Pawn d6. Pawn c3. Castles kingside. Pawn h3. Bishop b7. Pawn d4. Knight a5. Bishop c2. Knight c4. Pawn b3. Knight b6. Knight b1, d2. Knight b6, d7. Pawn b4. Pawn takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Pawn a5. Pawn takes a5. Pawn c5. Pawn e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight d5. Knight e4. Knight b4. Bishop b1. Rook takes a5. Queen e2. Knight b6. Knight f3, g5. Bishop takes e4. Queen takes e4. Pawn g6. Queen h4. Pawn h5. Queen g3. Knight c4. Knight f3. King g7. Queen f4. Rook h8. Pawn e6. Pawn f5. Bishop takes f5. Queen f8. Bishop e4. Queen takes f4. Bishop takes f4. Rook e8. Rook a1, d1. Rook a6. Rook d7. Rook takes e6. Knight g5. Rook f6. Bishop f3. Rook takes f4. Knight e6. King f6. Knight takes f4. Knight e5. Rook b7. Bishop d6. King f1. Knight c2. Rook e4. Knight d4. Rook b6. Rook d8. Knight d5. King f5. Knight e3. King e6. Bishop e2. King d7. Bishop takes b5. Knight takes b5. Rook takes b5. King c6. pawn a4, bishop c7, king e2, pawn g5, pawn g3, rook a8, rook b2, rook f8, pawn f4, pawn takes f4, pawn takes f4, knight f7, rook e6, knight d6, pawn f5, rook a8, rook d2, rook takes a4, pawn f6,